Yes.
अमृता को पता है बोल ना चल यार
But then my brother, he I can extend it.
Then okay, because of some well, in my they finally did change that.
But then you
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Just completely taking away the identity. And you know, I'm so amazed that like
Very good.
Well, at least now. Any good things was that? No, I'm not really sure of that.
You don't want to choose the
No, being a cooperative is much different from one individual like the proud right that means it is a corporation, but it is stated in our or people social they call it social.
Sports.
No, my reasoning was not that. My reasoning was that the policy issues and the government is what will be and that will then automatically yeah, Also about idea. But they probably getting money. So within 1 year, so it's a business. They want to have So the design projects I've never I will so you have to that's fine. There are other so you are laying like ideas that is there are so many there's more than that. I mean, there are like one C, there I don't know if you guys they are trying to get something.
All of that is basically
Let's take it one back. From Nigeria. they more or less all organizations are innovation sector. That's technology. So let's see that for our important. You fund yeah, technology. No, running is very expensive. I actually fund for running. I would fund it. Yeah, I would fund the running because I know that. No, it is a complex thing. Right? Cost money because the way it works is like they give this cost, you call them back, and they give them a big cost. They have some funding. So money, I would fund the technology. They have no. This company, yeah, we should. So the whole idea is they actually license it out to other things, but they are non-profit. Yeah. Someone is going to relay that to this where they go to. That's where I see not as a business. It's not business. Two functions. One, public policy, business will solve things, organizations are yeah. Not in the night. Why shouldn't they make cardboard fish?
No postcard.
So will actually because so will just time travel and some of the just
I think
Mistake we have done.
Everyone, please. Jandy is going to kill me if you are here. So, there's a board outside which is asking soliciting for ideas on transport sessions and also votes for each of the ideas. Please go outside and the whiteboard with markers.
You can explain what a transport session is.
Yes, so which he will do. He just wants me to shout and give you a
Okay, so there are transport sessions. Oh, we have
Mike.
no. We have enough time. And it doesn't work that hard. So transport sessions are sessions that couldn't come into the main set of sessions or topics which you thought of discussing but never did because of the session we have. So you can throw in ideas and people can vote for the ideas which are there. And the transport session starts at 7:40 p.m. So please vote and please submit your ideas on the whiteboard. Right, in the next few minutes.
It's up to you. And I'm going to go back after this. We want to rub off a few numbers. So
They really want to be in the nuts and bolts session. That is cool. So,
can you distribute these? Not many of those. You do this one. So you can see that. Can you see it? Yes. That's what people should say. Yeah. Okay. No, it's from here. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, no. It is easy. Oh, you want to sit there?
No, just eat.
Oh, yeah. You can. Is that someone? Thank you. I'm sure that's because they're pretty competent group. Okay, so if anybody is going to not need these after the thing, or if you feel like you could return it, please leave it at the desk. So Willie's going to take them back. Do you need them? And I'm going to leave some up front. So. Just to get one of these. I mean, yeah.
No dinner.
You can use these up there.
Hi everyone. I think we're going to start the session. We don't want our panelists to wait any longer. So I just wanted to introduce the session and introduce our speakers and then let them talk more about Bhopal and its connections to environmental justice struggles here in the US. So this is, as most of you know, the 30th anniversary of coming up with the 30th anniversary of the Bhopal disaster of 1984, and it seemed like something that we needed to mark at the A conference this year, and something that really struck us when we were trying to organize various actions for this session was that a lot of people asked why we were doing the session and what we hope to gain from it and why the 30th anniversary was any different from any other anniversary. And we didn't have a lot of answers for that. And I'm not sure we still have answers for that. In fact, I met with an organizer from the campaign, his name is Ryan, and he actually told me, if you're going to find it so difficult to convince people that Bhopal is still relevant in the 30th anniversary year, think about the 31st or 32nd one. What are you going to do then? So I thought, we all thought that it would be good to make the connections between Bhopal and struggles everywhere else a little more clear using this session. A couple of things that I wanted to talk about is my own engagement with the campaign after becoming a volunteer at DAY. I have also worked a little more closely with some of the more administrative work involved with this campaign. I visited Bhopal in 2012, and something that really struck me when I went there was that the communities struggling in Boulder were very different from what I had imagined them to be. I'm not really sure I had imagined them to be anything, but I definitely hadn't thought that they were going to be poor Muslim communities, mostly Muslim or lower caste Hindu communities, but extremely poor communities. Not something that was impressed on us when we were talking about the Bhopal campaign. The other thing that really struck me was that when I was working on some research on environmental justice, something that stood out to me was that there are other communities around the world, similar communities that are extremely poor, impoverished communities that are racial minorities, minorities in different ways, women maybe, but all of these communities have the same issue that they are located around facilities, chemical facilities that do not really care for the population around them. And this is the case in Bhopal, and not just in Bhopal, it's the case here in the United States too. The most important thing that we wanted to make clear in this session is that Bhopal has been an inspiration for some of the people struggling for environmental justice here in the US, not something that I was aware of until about 6 months back. There are laws that have come into effect in the US after the Bhopal disaster. In 1986, the Environmental Prevention of Sorry?
Environmental Protection Agency.
No, emergency planning, community right to know. That's what I meant to say, sorry. The act was passed and there was also the toxics regulatory inventory. Both of these were passed because the Congress wanted communities like Bhopal in the US to have information about the chemicals stored, produced, and manufactured in their areas. So there are two community organizers here today with us, William Fortnum and Maya and I, who are going to talk to us about their own struggles with environmental justice issues, and especially as they connect to Bhopal and the struggles in Bhopal. William Fortnum is a key advocate in the environmental justice movement. He has over 40 years of experience in this field. He has been a former community liaison officer for the Louisiana Attorney General's office, and he helped mobilize over 500 groups and exposed countless instances of corporate government corruption. He works with the International Campaign for Justice in Bhopal. He is also working with the Sierra Club Delta chapter and has previously worked with the Mississippi River Basin Alliance, Louisiana Environmental Action Network, and the Louisiana Labor Neighbor Project. One thing that you really need to know is that William is kind of a star in the environmental justice movement, and people always raise their eyebrows when I say William Fortnum is on our advisory board, so he's really famous. Maya and I is the president of People Concerned About Chemical Safety. She is actually from a community affected by an environmental justice issue. She learned about this issue when she was, I think, in college, much before that. But she actually comes from a community that is, I think her parents were also organizers. They worked for Union Carbide, okay. And Union Carbide had a factory in her community which also produced MIC, which is the gas that we in Bhopal. It was also the only facility producing MIC in the world other than Bhopal. And so Maya has been very closely associated with the struggle in Bhopal, and she is going to talk to us about some of that. But I think William is probably going to talk first. Is that?
It's a real pleasure to be here. And as I said, if you don't want to have this, please turn it in, because I use these and they don't get copied and pulled together easily. Anyway, for 27 years, I worked in Louisiana in a very unusual job. I had the only job in the United States working in the Attorney General's office at state level, helping citizens with environmental and social justice issues and challenges. When I got offered to do this job, I thought, no, working for state government, maybe 6 months, 2 years. But I ended up working in this job for 27 years. And in that 27 years, I learned a whole lot about industry and about helping people and the challenges that are out there with the news media and the public, and how to get things done. And I had this handout for you because for those of you who come in late, there's some copies over there and here if you want a copy. I was in the Attorney General's office when the first article here talks about 17,000 people being evacuated. That was the largest number, and I think it's still the largest number of people evacuated because of a chemical industry accident in the United States. No one was killed or injured, and they were very lucky. But the reason that they evacuated people is because there was a nuclear power plant under construction about a mile upriver. This is on the Mississippi River, about 20 miles upriver from New Orleans. And so the police in the local area, very rural area, but they decided, since they had gotten some training about evacuating in a nuclear power accident, they didn't have all the equipment in place yet, but they went around and knocked on everybody's home. And in the middle of the night, told them they needed to get out because they knew a little bit about the chemical with methyl isocyanate. Isocyanates are a very reactive chemical. If you mix them with water, they become a very violent chemical. So you don't want to be a fireman spraying on a puddle of methyl isocyanate, and you'll be in trouble. There were no methyl isocyanates at this is at Taft, Louisiana, a little small community that had been displaced by Union Carbide a few years earlier. The only thing that is in Taft related to people is there's a graveyard right next to the Union Carbide facility. It's now a Dow facility, Dow Chemical. And people still are buried in that graveyard. When they're there, they're right across the fence from a big chemical plant. But, and it would be kind of difficult evacuating if you're stuck in the graveyard trying to put a relative in the grave. But the importance of this accident with the 17,000 people evacuated is this occurred in December of 1982, which was 2 years before the December 1984 accident in Bhopal, India. And there was enough time for Union Carbide, which is a very large chemical plant. They had a chemical industry. They had about 700 facilities around the world. And if they were interested in their workers in the community and other workers at other industries, what they should have done and what they would do today is they would say, okay, we've got this really serious hazardous stuff, and we didn't kill anybody in this accident. Do we have any situations like this in other industries that we own and operate? And can we operate without this really hazardous material? Or can we reduce the amount of hazardous material that we have on site? Or can we use a substitute material that would produce the same thing, same product, and not be a real problem? And if they had asked those questions in 1984, they would not have killed a few thousand people and injured a few 100,000 people. And that's the importance of this article. It was an opportunity that was totally missed. The second article, which is on the back of this one, is about the same thing. So it is a slightly different perspective. But it'll give you, if you're interested, it'll give you a little information about how people respond to these types of things, or could have responded, or should have responded. And then the next thing in this handout is a photograph that I took Christmas Eve of 1989. This was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where I live. And I'm across the Mississippi River. It's not the clearest photograph. The picture that I took is in color, and so you can distinguish things a little easier. But what happened was, it was the coldest December that I remember. It got down to Baton Rouge is semi-tropical. We get a significant amount of rain every year because we're close to the Gulf of Mexico, and the water is, the air is circulating around it, full of water off the Gulf of Mexico. Temperature like this last winter, it got down to in the upper 20s 4 times, which is very unusual. Winters before that, it only got down to freezing once, down to 32. It didn't actually get any colder than 32. several winters. And so, but the winters there are cold because it's a very humid winter. But anyway, there had been some pipes on, this is the Exxon oil refinery in Baton Rouge. They process, at this time it was about 450,000 barrels of oil a day. Today it's a little more than 500,000 barrels of oil are processed into kerosene, gasoline, whatever else it's used. So it's the second largest oil refinery in the United States after the Exxon oil refinery in Baytown, Texas, which is the country's largest. They had some pipes with a gas, I don't remember what it is, but it's not natural gas. And it was being piped down and controlled by a computer system up in Mississippi, the state of Mississippi, which is just north of this part of Louisiana. And they had laid off some workers about 6 months earlier, Exxon had, and forgot to make sure that they had it clear when they were shutting down part of the refinery that they would tell the people who were piping the gas down to their facility to stop piping. And again, this is December 24th, and many of the workers at the plant were home for Christmas vacation. This particular pipe that ruptured had been scheduled to be replaced because this gas had corroded the inside of this metal pipe, and the pipe was only about half as, maybe a third as thick as it should have been, because the gas had corroded the inside of the pipe out. And because they had shut down most of the refineries, these things were freezing. The refineries down in Louisiana are not like a refinery we have in the northern part of the country that are built to withstand cold. And they would have to spend more money to build it. The pipes had been scheduled to be replaced because of the corrosion inside of the pipe. And Exxon knew that it was a problem, but each of the two succeeding plant managers didn't want to spend that money while they were there. They have plant managers change about every 2 years, and then they move up to another position. And so they had laid off a bunch of workers for the people who would have known that this pipe needed to be changed, had been moved to other jobs, and new people came in and they were told not to worry about it. Everything's okay, but they got under this real cold condition, and the pipe ruptured. And it made a great big cloud. This was about 10:30 in the morning, and I was in my house, and it was boom! And the day before, I'd gone out and taken photographs of Exxon and stuff. They were flaring off a lot of materials that they would have normally been processed because they would shut those units down. They were burning off a lot of gases. But I heard the first boom, and then there was a second boom. The second boom was on all refineries. You have a lot of open flames, and it made this very big. When the pipe ruptured, it made this very big cloud of very flammable gas, and it ignited and made a very loud boom, and it shook my house. And my house is about 2 miles from where this black smoke is coming off the ground. It blew out windows in the state capitol. State capitol is on the right side of this photograph. It's called state capitol in the United States, in Louisiana. Yes, bigger than somebody. And that was built by Hugh Long, who some of you may have heard of, who's governor of Louisiana and U.S. Senator and wanted to run for president during the Depression. But anyway, the second boom, it blew open the security doors at the governor's mansion and blew out windows in the state capitol. And it made this very big cloud. And I ran out of my front yard and I said, which direction did that noise come from? neighborhood within his front yard. And he pointed north, and I went, excellent. And there was a great big mushroom cloud, which turned into this a little bit later. And my point of having this in here, this had been a tank of methyl isocyanate, but what killed all the people, it killed a lot of people in Bhopal, India. It would have, the smoke would have reached my house, and it would have killed me and my wife and kids, and my brother-in-law who was visiting with us. So just because you live 3 or 4 miles from a hazardous operation doesn't mean that you're safe. Maybe it doesn't connect with the people out there. Most people have no idea what's in their community, what's a block away, 2 or 3 blocks away. People may have things on their property or use things. It's extremely hazardous, and none of their neighbors know about it. The police don't know about it. So there's a lot that goes on in every country, every state in this country that is that real hazard. Is any of this making sense? The next thing in the handout is something that I ran across just by accident. It's written by, I don't have the correct pronunciation, I don't think, Jung Umi, who's a writer in Japan, and he wrote about environmental disasters in Japan, and this is a shortened version of what he wrote. The thing that he wrote is about 14 pages long, and this one was really just a couple of paragraphs that was in a book that somebody was storing away, and I said, if you don't want that, I'd be glad to have the history of environmental law in Japan, and it's written by MIT Press. And it identifies this writer as one of the more insightful writers in the world, or in Japan, about environmental issues. And I emailed back and forth with this guy a few times with that time to write. And if you'd like a copy of the 14-page thing, you can send me an email and I'll send it to you. Or if you go to any university library and look up Japan Forward, the 3rd quarter of 1972, and it is a really worth document to look at. And his approach is that if you take it on an issue like Bhopal, and he wrote this thing 12 years before Bhopal, most groups in Japan that have dealt with issues, if they get involved in litigation, like the Minamata mercury contamination case, they went to the Supreme Court in Japan. It took them about 10 years to get there. And all of the people that spent all of their money to helping lawyers to be able to bring the case, and when they got there, they settled for about 10% of what it was that they were trying to get. And they were all exhausted, and they spent all their time, and they were sort of angry and disappointed. And Louis said that if you can identify who it is that you need to go after, is it the plant manager, is it the safety center, is the plant manager, is the governor, is it the president of the bank, or whoever it is. And if you can go after them, and as well as doing whatever your work is, so filing a lawsuit or holding protests or something, but if you can figure who might be responsible for whatever it is you're dealing with, and go do something to hold them responsible, no need to do violence, but then your chances of success are dramatically increased. And it's an interesting way to approach life. I think it's the best thing I've ever read. I'm trying to get organized and trying to be successful. And it doesn't have to be an environmental issue. It's whatever you're dealing with. If you don't like, you get something at the grocery store, you don't like the way it looks or tastes, Where would you go? Would you just bring it back to the store? Would you just throw it away? Or would you figure out who left it so that it's beyond its expiration date? Have any of you ever bought anything beyond its expiration date? Milk or anything, yeah. You know, things that have an expiration date because they've had incidents where once it gets beyond that date, before that date, but usually when it gets beyond that date, it can start having problems. It can get sick. It might not be a serious sick, but in some cases it can be very serious. And who do you complain to, or if you complain, or who do you think about bringing this issue to, or trying to make sure that this kind of thing, whatever it is, Chevrolet is going through, General Motors is going through a tremendous amount of trouble right now because they have some very defective parts that kill some people, and they knew about it and didn't tell people. And so right now they're having a very difficult time. If you don't operate correctly, it can cost you real serious time and money if you're a business. The next thing that I have here is a little fellow in Baton Rouge who does industrial maps and industries. You get on his site and you can find out a lot of information about what materials industries in Baton Rouge produce, how many workers they have, what their kind of products are. And these are facilities in parts of Texas, all of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and part of Florida. These are states on the Gulf of Mexico. And there are a lot more major industries in those, particularly in Florida and Texas, especially Texas. But this is just something that we introduced because it's convenient. These are major industrial facilities. All refiners, chemical plants, and each one of them could have a low-fall type disaster. And you wouldn't know that if you drove around Louisiana and Texas, unless you came to Baton Rouge, where there's a bunch of chemical plants and all refiners in the city and next to the city. So just because you don't know what's in your neighborhood, it's a good thing to try and learn a little more about it. They're better life, potentially. And I just want to show you, these are a lot of very large industrial facilities. If I had a map of the United States like this, it would be a very cluttered place. Most countries have this kind of development. The next thing in this handout is this page, and I put this in here just so you know that after the disaster in Bhopal, the United States Congress started looking at could an accident like that happen here, and they found out yes it could, because methyl isocyanate was being used and produced in West Virginia, and the senator from West Virginia at the time was one of the more powerful senators. And after an accident happened at that facility in West Virginia, he went, whoa, we need to do something. So they created this new government body, but it happened in 1992, so it was a few years after the war. It's the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board. And their model is they're kind of created like the U.S. Transportation Safety Board. The Transportation Safety Board is a group that goes in and deals with airplane accidents, train derailments and accidents, and that sort of thing, with people being transported from one place to another. But before the Transportation Safety Board was created, airplanes were falling out of the sky all over the place. Lots of people died. said, there's got to be some way to make airplanes safer. So we created the Transportation Safety Board, and today you can get on an airplane and feel pretty sure that you're going to get where you're going, or you have to divert because of weather or something. But your chances of being in a disaster in an airplane anywhere in the world is just dramatically improved because of transportation safety. So the Chemical Safety Board, I have a friend, Jerry Poggi. Dr. Poggi is the first member appointed to the 5-member Chemical Safety Board in 1992. It didn't get fully funded until like 95, but they have investigated thousands of accidents. How did this accident happen? What caused it? And how can it be prevented? And then they can get in touch with similar facilities that are operating the same way, that have the same process, and say, look, this gadget fell off this plant and it blew up, or part of it blew up and it killed 20 people or 10 people. It damaged half the plant, which is worth $400 million. You might want to make sure that your valve, and you know that you have one, is working correctly, so you won't blow up your plant. And it's led to very dramatic reductions of industrial accidents. There's still a lot of them in this country and around the world. And but anyway, if you want to learn something about industrial accidents, you can go on their website, Chemical Safety Board, and all of their investigations are accessible to the public. Really some incredible work. And a couple of years ago, there was an explosion at a warehouse in West Texas. You may have heard of it, West Texas. And what happened is the local fire department pretty much wiped out. I think they lost 12 of their firefighters and 2 or 3 emergency people who were at the fire. There was a wooden warehouse where a vast amount of agricultural fertilizer was being stored. And it was a very explosive fertilizer. And it pretty much leveled most of the town. And President Obama heard about it. He created he issued an executive order. He's had about 7 or 8 of the federal agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Chemical Safety Board, Department of Interior, and others, to go around the country and hold a series of hearings, and they're about to issue their findings. And so if you'd like to do something dealing with trying to help reduce chemical accidents, you can Google executive order of industrial safety, reducing industrial accidents, and that executive order will pop up, and you can send a letter to 2 U.S. senators in whatever state you're in, and a member of Congress that represents the university where you live. Tell them that you think the country needs safer industries. And to get that before they come out with their final report, which I think is going to be in the next couple of months. That might help. And that's, and then I've got my bio for what we just read to you, and several books that have me in part of what they're doing. So, and then I have, after that, I've got 2.5 pages of basically what I just told you. And then the last page are 4 people that I think are very important. The list of who has dealt with this kind of issue, how you deal with government in the industry. Could be 100 pages long. heard of 2 or 3 of these. And Muhammad Ali, from India. But Miles Harden is a guy that I think most people haven't heard of, but should have. Mr. Harden started a school in Tennessee, in a place called Highlander. And he originally focused on dealing with workers and trying to help them figure out how to organize and be more effective. And he basically got the workers, unions, and safety projected and changed workers all across around the world in the United States. And then after he did that in the 50s and 60s, he got involved in the civil rights movement. And it was the first time that in the southern part of the United States that people of color and people, I guess, like me, could actually meet in a public place and have a discussion. And some of the people that met there, Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. And, Rosa Parks is a woman who was in Montgomery, Alabama, and got on the bus and refused to get off the bus and said to the back of the bus. And she happened to work 2 weeks before she refused to get off the bus. She had been a Highlander in the 2-week thing that they did at Highlander. And at the end of the 2 weeks, Miles Harden had everybody write down 30 people sitting around big rocking chairs and talking, saying something, have discussions about how to be more effective. And Rosa Parks, everybody had to write down what they were going to do when they got home. Rosa Parks wrote down, I don't know, but I'm going to do something. And she was working at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP office in Montgomery, Alabama. And her husband was an attorney with NAACP. And it was 2 weeks later when she got into the bus and refused to move. But she knew how to act when she got on the bus. She didn't have the bus driver. And so it's a legend. And then in the 70s and 80s, Miles Harden focused on the environment. And I never met him, but that's how I got on our groups. And I'm going to stop talking, so let's get those. So I'll probably talk too long.
How are you guys doing? Whoa. Wow. Yeah, we'll do questions at the end. Yeah. So, as Renu said, my name is Maya Nye. I'm with an organization called People Concerned About Chemical Safety in the Kanawha Valley, West Virginia, which we call very fondly Chemical Valley. Our organization is actually about 30 years old, and we work to promote international human rights pertaining to environmental and chemical safety through education and advocacy. And we're dedicated to the health and safety of all of those who reside, work, and study in the vicinity of chemical plants producing highly toxic chemicals. We were previously known as People Concerned About MIC. We formed right around the time of the Bhopal disaster, and we have some connections with Bhopal. First, let me ask, how many people in this room actually know what the Bhopal disaster was? I don't want to assume. Is there anybody in here that doesn't know? It's okay to raise your hand. No. Is everybody alive when the Bhopal disaster happened? Just kind of trying to gauge it. Is anyone in here personally affected by the Bhopal disaster? Okay. Well, I have a quick clip that I want to show you, and I just want to give a brief warning that it's a little bit graphic. So I just gonna work this really quickly. I think I can figure it out. Got it. This is from a documentary called Chemical Valley. Like the internet just quit working. Actually. Wow. Please excuse the technical difficulties. Well, I tell you what, I'll go ahead and, oh wait. That's something different. All right, I tell you what, well, while you guys are figuring that out, I'll tell you. So, so Union Carbide is actually located a mile away from where I grew up. And we were the only community in the world that actually manufactured methyl isocyanate in 5 times the amount what caused the Bhopal disaster. I was 8 when the Bhopal disaster happened, and so I remember it, and it had repercussions, I think, as everyone knows, across the world, but it definitely had repercussions in my community, because that facility is the one after which the Bhopal plant was modeled. It was probably people in my community that actually helped engineer that facility. All right, so just a couple of quick minutes here. Again, graphic warning.
From the Southern Mountains, Headwaters, a part of Pickle Shop.
On December 3rd, 1984, the worst industrial accident in history occurred when 40 tons of methyl isocyanate, known as MIC, leaked from the Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal, India.
We're talking about maybe about 5,000 people dead, which will be very hard to document because many people fled Bhopal and died in cities other than Bhopal. We're talking about at least 50,000 persons who are facing serious medical problems. There is no doubt that it is a carcinogen and it is a mutant. That people who have been exposed will suffer for the rest of their life and future generations will suffer. There is no doubt about it.
I was in Boulder down Disney. Just as I got out of the car, I heard this thing, boat going and killed Dixon and people had a Carbide Institute jacket on the thing. I just took the jacket off and stuck it back in the car. Right, just as soon as I found out the situation, I think a lot of people felt that very often. The fact that you were part of it.
The only place in the United States that manufactures MIC the chemical used in the process of making pesticides, is the Union Carbide Institute plant, located in the Canal Valley of West Virginia.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. All of us here at the Institute plant have been deeply saddened by the tragic event in India. And we extend our sympathy to all the people in the city of Boulder. I'm pleased to have an opportunity to make a point here this morning. The employees of the Institute plant have been manufacturing MIC in an effective and safe manner for 17 years. We are extremely proud of that safety record. We are confident in the ability of our trained, dedicated, skilled, and experienced people. We are confident in the equipment that we operate, the safety precautions that we utilize, the monitoring systems that we have, and our planned emergency preparedness.
It is the best insecticide, as far as I'm concerned, on the market. It's say that
We get choked up every time I watch that. I'm sure I think I heard a lot of you as well. 8 months after that incident happened, there was a release of alcarboxane in our community, and hundreds of people were sent to the hospital, including my friend Cam. So the incident in Bhopal, and that incident that happened 8 months after, really hit home for us. And having the Bhopal disaster to look at as what the possibilities could be was pretty big. So, like Lily said, actually as a result of those 2 incidents, a lot of us had no idea what the world was in our backyard. And as a result of those incidents, the Emergency Planning and Community Rights to Know Act was formed. And that act ensured that chemical facilities had to let people in their backyard know what the dangers were, know what it was that they were storing, know what the possibilities are. So that's a really positive thing that came out of a really terrible incident. That law has actually recently been rolled back, but and it's not as easy to get access to that information. But another one that came out of that was the risk management plan. And what that required was that facilities who are producing highly toxic chemicals, like the facility in Bhopal, like the one in my backyard, had to actually assess what are the vulnerabilities should another Bhopal disaster happen. Should there be a worst case scenario, because that's what Bhopal was. It was our worst nightmare. And so companies then had to assess that risk. So that's another wonderful thing that came out of a horrible tragedy. And as Willie mentioned, the Chemical Safety Board was finally implemented. Chemical Safety Board has actually been in my community recently, 3rd time in 6 years, because we've had 3 major incidents. One that killed 2 workers and a couple of community members. One that killed another worker at a DuPont facility. A man was sprayed in the face with phosgene, which was a World War I nerve agent. And recently for the water contamination issue that some of you may have heard of. That's all happened within 6 years, within about a 20-mile vicinity from where I grew up. MIC, we were the only facility in the world that continues to manufacture and stockpile MIC for 25 years after the Bhopal disaster happened. We stored it in up to 5 times what caused the Bhopal disaster. So those images are constantly images that I had in my head when I learned that MIC was still being manufactured in our neighborhood facility. Why? Why were we the only ones that continue to do that? DuPont in LaPorte, Texas, they went to making and using MIC on demand. They re-engineered their process because they said, we can't handle another Bhopal-like tragedy. We can't handle the public relations disaster that it causes. We can't handle the environmental and the human degradation that happens as a result of it. So we're going to transition. Our community didn't do that. So when I was 16, that's when I began to question why. And when I was 16, I was sitting in my house, which, as I told you, was about a mile away from that facility that you saw when there was an explosion, much like the explosion that Willie mentioned. I heard something, I felt something, I thought a tree limb had hit my house. Went outside to check, didn't see a tree limb, thought okay. The next thing I know, an alarm was going off, shelter-in-place alarm. And there was a fire truck coming down my street, my one-way street, the wrong way, saying there's a shelter-in-place in effect, close all windows, turn off all ventilation systems. There's a shelter-in-place in effect until further notice. So I called my dad, who worked at Union Carbide, to try to find out what was going on. And when I tried to get a hold of him, all of the phone lines were jammed, because that's what happened when major incidents happen. So I was 16 and I was scared to death. And I grabbed the duct tape and I taped up all of the cracks around the windows in my house, because that's what they taught us to do in school. That didn't work. The chemicals had already invaded my house. I didn't know what it was. It was actually not until 2008 that I actually learned what had invaded my house. It was a pesticide. So that moment is really what made me start questioning. Why is my community having to deal with this? How is it that my father can work for an industry that potentially could have just killed me? And I kept questioning that. I went to school and continued questioning that through college, and it was Union Carbide dollars that actually sent me to college. And it was Union Carbide dollars that put food on my table. And at some point I finally understood that. You know, it was that there were no other choices in our community other than to work for the chemical industry. Not to say that you know, if there had been other choices, my dad would have worked somewhere else. Who knows? But the fact is that chemicals were to my valley, much like coal is to the coal fields in West Virginia. It's the main source of economic sustenance. So when you question the hand that feeds you, it becomes very dicey. That's why our community continued to manufacture and store in my city for so long. And Willie showed a map. I'm actually going to show you another one. Willie showed you a map of a bunch of facilities. This is actually a map of the United States. And if you said it would be all cluttered, you wouldn't be able to really tell what it is. Well, I'm pretty sure that the red dots are high-risk facilities. Yeah, the red dots are high-risk facilities that require this risk management plan. And the blue flags, those are schools. And all of the schools that I attended as a child were within 1 mile of a high-risk facility. So I was actually part of, let me go back. So yes, it might happen anywhere in the United States. It might happen in other places in the world. But I can guarantee you that the backyards that those will happen in are probably going to be communities of color or low-income communities. And actually, I was part of an organization called the Environmental Justice and Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. And we recently went to D.C. and we gave a report to Gina McCarthy, who is the administrator of the EPA. And my page has disappeared. We actually released a report called Who's in Danger? Race, Poverty, and Chemical Disaster that actually illustrates that those communities, the communities of color and low-income communities, document that they are going to be more at risk to have a Bhopal-like disaster. So And those communities typically have less access to political power to create change in their community. And that's why, for 25 years, we continue to manufacture and store MSC. And that's why in 2008, an explosion in the exact same unit blew up when I was 16, nearly eclipsed another Bhopal disaster, according to a congressional investigation. That was in 2008. The 2008 investigation actually showed that the MIC tank was in severe disrepair, the underground tanks. And so the company actually ended up revamping their facility. And when they did that, we ended up filing a lawsuit to prevent them from restarting the unit. And the reason, one of the reasons we actually never went to trial, one of the reasons why we were successful in our case, the company decided that they were no longer going to manufacture and store MIC. And one of the reasons why we were successful is because we had the Bhopal disaster to look at. So that's why the Bhopal disaster is relevant 30 years later, 31 years later, 32, 40 years later. It helps communities like mine, be able to demonstrate what our worst nightmare is. It helped us create chemical safety policy in the United States that inch by inch, 19 inch by inch, has made things safer. I wish the Chemical Safety Board were more like the National Transportation Board. I wish they had regulatory authority, because unfortunately what's happening is that they're making a lot of really great recommendations that are not being followed through with. And if they were being followed through with, facilities or communities like mine might be in lesser danger these days. I want to be conscious of time. I know I'm running here. So just a couple more things. EPA actually banned, MIC was used for pesticide manufacturing. It was used to create a pesticide. And recently the EPA actually banned that pesticide in the United States because it was so toxic. It was a deadly neurotoxin. And it had been produced in my community for a number of years. So we might not have the threat of another Bhopal in West Virginia any longer, but that's only because of MIC is gone. We still store mass quantities of anhydrous ammonia, chlorine, ethylene oxide, all kinds of very highly hazardous chemicals. And those facilities that produce those, a lot of those schools are still there. You know, one of the schools that I went to shut down, but they're within 1 mile of these highly toxic facilities. So I would just say that while we are making progress here in the United States, the recent incident in West Virginia with the contamination, we have the largest chemical contamination of the drinking water supply in the United States. That's the most recent of incidents that happened in our communities. So we knew what would happen. We knew we lived under the threat of a Bhopal for many years. And now I feel like our community had a brief amount of time to feel like what it's been like for the 25 and 30 years after the Bhopal disaster, that people have been going without clean drinking water, because that facility still has not been cleaned up. Those toxins are still there. They're still in the groundwater. So I would say that's kind of going to wrap things up. And I will just say that cleaning up Bhopal is actually just a basic. It's basic humanity. It's a basic human right that people should have clean drinking water and clean air. And I actually, I want to respond to the panel that came just before us. You actually asked the question, what can people do? What can we do as aid to ensure that that women are engaged and that we're not, discriminating against women? And it made me actually think about the larger environmental justice perspective of how you involve marginalized people in a meaningful way in the decision-making process. That is something that is very, very important. And it was the women who, actually, I didn't even mention this part, is a very important part. So that facility that was in my community, I lived across the river, but the community that lives right on the fence line is a black community. It's a historically black university that's literally right on the fence line there. And it was black women in that community that raised their voices and raised their concerns for 30 years that inspired me to stand up and use my voice for the next generation. So I think that's all I have to say. Michelle, you're going to mention a few things or any news? That's what I go. Thank you very much. Oh, and I have some cards here if anybody wants my contact information.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you very much. I think this gives us a sense the fact, understanding that Bhopal is not an isolated incident and that Bhopal is not an incident that happened. It's still happening in India. People are still suffering from what happened in 1984. Water is still contaminated, soil is still contaminated. There are birth defects that are showing up now in second generation of people who were exposed back then, and also people who were exposed to contamination from water and from drinking that water. So there's also issues with women's bodies, and I think even in Bhopal, women have been at the forefront of the movement from the beginning, and that is something we always need to keep in mind, that Bhopal is just not a fight against Dow Chemical, it's also a women's movement, it's also an environmental justice movement. In fact, there's so many intersections in the Bhopal movement that I think what keeps some of us who engage with this campaign, we find out so many more issues that keep coming up. Labor issues, women's rights, reproductive justice, environmental justice, all kinds of issues that keep us going on this campaign, making us realize that it's so important to engage, that we can't let go of this campaign. It's not a campaign that is highly visible and therefore doesn't need our help anymore. It is a campaign that still needs our help. There's over 500,000 people affected by this, even now in India. So Pooja and I, Pooja is an Eat Boston volunteer. Pooja and I have been involved with the Bhopal campaign for quite some time. And what we have noticed is that we always have a lot of work to do, and we really love some help with more hands to just distribute some of the work that we end up doing. But more importantly, we also would like to brainstorm with the crowd here on what can aid do in this 30th anniversary year, because this is something that we always come up against. It's been 30 years, nothing we've done has really helped. But some things that we really need to keep in mind is that aid has been at the forefront of the Bhopal campaign here in the US. And I think from 2000 onwards, it has been extremely active with the Bhopal campaign. And we have won some very small victories, but very important victories after aid has started engaging with the Bhopal campaign. So, for example, the communities now have access to clean drinking water. The water is still contaminated around the facility, and there's thousands and thousands of tons of hazardous waste below the soil. Although I think a lot of times we feel it as 350 tons. It's much, much more than that. So it has never been cleaned up, but the government of India has now the manipulation. I always get confused about that. But the government has now agreed and is supplying water to most of the 22 communities because these are affected by water contamination. So people finally have a way to get clean water, but at the same time, groundwater is still contaminated. The soil is contaminated. So We have won small victories by putting pressure from the US on the government of India. For instance, I think when Rajan Sharma, the lawyer who works on the case that has now been thrown out, but at the time when he first got involved with the case, what was really important was that NRIs here, people in the US from India, when they put pressure on the government of India, that's when the Indian government got involved. And until the Indian government got involved, there was no way that we could proceed with the case. So that was something that came about as a direct result of the pressure we put from the US. So something like that really needs most of us to engage in. I think we all know that campaigns in India, all campaigns that we are active in, really get a boost from some of the things we do here. It's not immediately apparent, but there is something that we can do from here, especially because Bhopal is a transnational movement that involves both the US and India, unlike some of the other campaigns that we involve in. Pooja, did you want to talk about some of the things that we need help with?
I actually wanted to ask a question because there were already questions. So, my question really was about organizing. Obviously, you guys have a ton of experience in organizing communities, getting people together. That's something that happens in India. But what would be, this is something Day1 and I struggle with, how do we get communities organized here as well? What is the thing that we should do to get Bhopal up? And what can we as aid do? Just your stories and experiences.
Well, I will say that sometimes organizing in marginalized communities can be very challenging just because it's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting dealing with the issue. And so if there are people who are less exhausted, getting them involved and willing to volunteer and listen to the people who are on the ground and need help, getting them to be some of those workers, that's extremely important. So I think the fact that this is here is really important. And I'll just say that there's no justice in my community until there's justice in Bhopal. And I would really like to see Madhya Pradesh up on the slide next year.
Over the last 40-something years, I've helped to organize 500 something groups across the United States and two other countries on a wide variety of issues, which is environmental and social justice. And what I've always tried to do, in many of the groups I've never met, I always try to picture myself as one of the people in the group. You were a group that I was meeting, but I would think that I'm you or you, and try to learn something about you and what is it that you're trying to do. And organizing from your perspective rather than my perspective. And so when I walk into the room, you're looking at me going, who is this stupid guy and what does he get to tell us? Like, trying to approach it from the people's perspective. And of those more than 500 groups that I felt organized, I would say that only 4 or 5 of them were not successful in whatever it was they were trying to do. Many of those groups are still active today, dealing with a wide variety of things. So it's a matter of trying to figure out what it is that you want to do, and then find some other group or person that has dealt with that kind of issue, and what success or failure have they had. And then many people have no idea who their next door neighbor is. And they don't know anything beyond whatever route they usually take to get to work, school, or whatever they're doing. And you need to learn more about your neighborhood. Whether Mr. Rogers saying, wouldn't you like to know who's in your neighborhood? Most people don't know who and what is in their neighborhood. And so I had a friend who really took that, and she would make up a map of her neighborhood with whatever chemical plants and waste sites were in it. And most people had no idea that that was in their neighborhood. You just have to many groups I work with, it's taken 10, 15, 20 years to deal with whatever they're trying to deal with. Some people are successful in 6 months or 1 month. It's usually a much longer struggle. My title of my autobiography was into the long haul, is the name of it. That's really what it is. It's not a weekend activity.
I want to add just one more thing with that, what I think is also an effective organizing strategy is personal stories. And the survivor story has been something that was extremely effective in our community because football then suddenly wasn't this thing that happened so long ago in the past, but it was there and it was in front of our faces and people heard the personal stories and that, I think, impacts people. Another question?
Don't be shy. Pretend like it's important.
My question is how to make this relevant in today's world and with maybe Day and other groups in India as well. So there's a nuclear plants that are going on in India, and the whole idea of capping the nuclear activity will go come out. And after what happened in the Gulf with the BP, there's been this effect that what we can learn from Bhopal is carry that knowledge of what happens when there is no regulation and when there is no liability when Union Carbide says or India and then Dow says that they're not with Union Carbide or India. And then French company Arriva, they are going to sell these fast breeder reactors. India is going to be the largest nuclear plant in the world on a earthquake zone. So right now in Kulam, there are 8,000 people who are under Section 124A. They have been charged with sedition, and because they're protesting our front, and there has been an accident there last week. So how can we connect? I mean, if that is one way to connect, because there's Bhopal and the second generation of people who have grown up from Bhopal, and I don't know if many people can connect directly to that. And yes, there are stories of chemical plants in the backyard in India and here. A lot of things happening in damage that ties operations in India today. I think that's something.
Connecting to a larger movement is, for me, I think is of utmost importance. The Fukushima event actually happened in the middle of our lawsuit, and I think that again brought home worst case scenario. So communities that are dealing with what could happen should a catastrophic nothing happen, like these groups, connecting those communities is super important.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Chitin from the India. In terms of immediate response, what I find is like it's okay to see what is the current challenges when it comes to Bhopal disaster, because as Pooja was referring to that, a lot of people continue to remain affected by the contamination and also the disaster. And also there is a lot more chemicals, either underneath or still continues to pollute, which means I think it literally shows the accountability of what the Union Carbide and also the particular company, and also the accountability of what the government of the United States and also the government of India. And I think because accountability is just something we still, because they cannot, what I find is like it seems the blame game used to refer to, and in that blame game, the issue of justice and accountability seems to get that space, not in the center stage, So now, and I think I'm not following the Union Carbide story, the Bhopal disaster to that extent, but it seems like there is some recent adjustment on providing compensation to some of the victims. But the issue of justice should go beyond compensation. How do you clean up? How far? I think there is a fundamental challenge as of now. Because and now instead of reflecting on the accountability issue, I think one of the key challenges when it comes to the issues of other privatization process. Now, like for example, the government of India, they continue to still cooperate with the United States, the government here, in terms of pursuing, and also with a lot more other developed countries across Europe or other countries, to pursue the self-development model, like Union Carbide. might not be chemical, but it's other form of so-called quote-unquote development project which will continue to impact the lives and the environment and also the future of the new generation. I think that's still continuing to be pursued. And the challenge that comes up again is like how prepared is the government? How prepared are the chemical or any private corporate companies to respond to disaster? And I think that is something that it's a question that keeps coming back to us when we talk about. Probably tomorrow I'll share on the dam, on the effect of exploration, and it's going to be also referring to that explosion of the Exxon Mobil, the refinery, because these are something which comes back to us, and also the question is something which comes to us, So basic, in conclusion, like the basic immediate step that we talk about, or even you can respond probably is like immediately specific on the global basis, like to press for accountability, to hold the government of the United States, to hold the government of India, and also the corporate community to be accountable, to clean up the mess, and also to make sure that, I mean, an accountability process goes beyond compensation. So I think that is the fundamental aspect that we continue to press. And secondly, to also respond to the other forms of privatization process, the corporatization of people's land, corporatization of our resource or future. So I think, and through the privatization process, without clear-cut regulatory framework, now, like for example, India is coming up with this PPP, private, what is it? Public-private cooperation, but in reality, it's the private sector who will take a lead. So without any establishing clear-cut norm for accountability, without clear-cut establishing the norm for ensuring security justice, when those disasters happen. So I think this is another area which I think we all need to respond. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that in 2008, I think we had Rashida P. and Sabina Sarangi, who was in college with me, and they came, and it was really humbling and eye-opening. We didn't get to talk with them. I wanted to follow up on what he said. What could we do now, and forgive your as aid and the specifics that you're thinking of? Because after their visit, there were a number of things that happened, including our chapters, but frankly, right now, so what are things that could be done and connect to the overall global networks?
I was wondering if you can throw that question back to the audience.
What do we need to do?
Yeah, like what can aid do? This is something that would really help because we have so many people
Hi, just a quick, sorry, maybe. Most of what we've been talking about is accountability, and it's certainly very important. Another thing is, it is mentioned that the chemical safety code came up in the US and people were important here. I was wondering, doesn't that know what happened in India? Did anything change since they did code? Or if not, isn't that something it should be really trying to talk about?
Question. So, I'm going to pick on a few things that they said. I'm interested in the larger issue of this, and I've watched the documentary, and I want to ask about something that is specific. So, how is testing the hand that feeds you going to play into future things? Because now India has gone to this, they're going to develop. So, how is it going to change and affect things in terms of development? Because the question comes down to, are we going to develop technologies? Are they going to be more powerful, economically viable? Is having a plant here, going to prevent them from not getting food, not getting customers, not getting roads?
I think
what do you juggle those?
I think that's a good question to ask, and my only response to that is that I have a shirt that says I am not an acceptable risk factor. So unless the people who are making decisions are willing to live on the fence line and live with the repercussions of what can and will and continually happen in communities of color and Muslim communities on a daily basis, then I think that's a very good question to ask. And I don't know that I have any better answers.
And also the area is in the sense that you know the backlash with the anti-nuclear power issues. So if we want to approach you as an organization and we're going to go up against development, it's going to be perceived as against development in general. And I've actually, when people have come to me and said you support Maoists, so I'm not going to join the organization. I don't know where that came from. I don't know how to answer that. I just walked away.
I do have a better answer, actually. So in this report that I told you that we laid out to Administrator McCarthy, the EPA, we suggest that there are safer, effective, available alternatives, and that companies should be utilizing those. If there are facilities that are already existing, they should assess the feasibility of that, and they should transition to that. So that is something that is extremely important. And just on another note, I would say that if I don't want it in my backyard, doesn't mean that I want it in anybody else's backyard either. So the fact that MIC is no longer being produced in my community doesn't mean I want to see that facility that they just recently re-engineered go to China and impact somebody else. So those are my two better answers.
I mean, a couple of things. I think if you look at the number of states that are represented at this meeting, people are living, working, going to school in different states. If each one of those groups that are here would go to the office of the U.S. Senators, there's 2 U.S. Senators in every state. And if you're in a major city, they probably have an office in that city. They probably have an office here. If they're not here, they're in Denver. Go to those offices, and you want to give the staff of the U.S. Senator, and if the Senator happens to be in town, get a meeting with the Senator and say, we were at a meeting last week, and we heard these people talking about how the federal agencies are making some recommendations about how our cities and our countries and other countries can be safer. And we'd like to know what the Senator is going to do to support this effort to make this a better place to live. So if you can't feel safe in your community, I mean, I don't feel safe in the community that I live in. But I told my wife, she said, should we be living here? I said, well, we don't know what the hazards are in any place that we might move to. Or it could happen one way. It could be a pipeline, it could be a train wreck, it could be a barges, it could be things that you can't even imagine. I mean, there are more than 80,000 chemicals that are used in the world today. We have really good information on maybe 500 of them. We have reasonably good information on about 2,500 of them. And we have almost no information available on the community. Yeah. I mean, when the chemical leaked in her community, I called Jerry Poggi, who was the first guy appointed to the Chemical Safety Board, and I said, Jerry, what do you know about this chemical? And he said, Willie, so this is the same day that the release occurred. He said, Willie, I know how to access this information. And he said, there's no information available to the Chemical Safety Board or to the public about the chemical that leaked in the release. None. I mean, so there are lots of facilities, and it may only be how many gallons of that stuff. It was a 10,000 gallon tank. 10,000 gallons is not, I mean, it's a lot for a bathing pool, swimming pool or something, or bath. But 10,000 gallons is not a lot. But for that to take out the drinking water for more than 300,000 people, that's significant. And what the officials in West Virginia could find out, the governor, the state police, what they could find out in the first couple of hours after this stuff started showing up, smelling like, tasting like licorice, was nothing. So,
I've got a great addition to that.
Well, And go ahead.
Well, I think that's a good reason why, those kinds of studies should be done before they are manufactured, stored, applied, transported through, disposed of in any communities. And I had another additional that. Especially if developments are still occurring and then maybe facilities haven't been constructed, reducing that vulnerability zone. So we know that from that map, the vulnerability zone for my area is 25 miles. That's only because that's the biggest force. There's not actually there could be much more. But so the vulnerability zone for West Virginia is 25 miles. Maybe you should reconsider whether or not people actually live in that 25-mile radius. What are the emergency routes? What are people going to do for the catastrophic events happen? So those are things that should really be put in place.
I really consider these two points that if you cannot move beyond the chemical distance and to this broader issue of privatization and lack of regulation, then I do not think that it is really possible to execute. And I'm just being honest, because I've been seeing how it has been happening for the last 7 years with the focus. And yes, like every year around December, there's some talk about it and some things, but to what is the team? And because of the community that we and many of us are engaging like engaging with the issues here, maybe kind of secondary to what people are more interested in, is like what's happening there and there. I would also like to mention the new Foreign Policy Regulation Act of 2011. It's really very difficult to set a plan to question a policy. And this is the thing. If you policy question and you hear power safety plan, what is the cap? Do you know? And then you have the issue our everything gets scrapped. So it becomes very difficult at that end. But and certainly with Fukushima, that big disaster is applicable one and besides, it's not a good question of not in a backyard. But yes, there are chemical plants here and West Texas, as you said, like terrible thing that's happening. But to engage within our group and to make it more effective, and I think we really have to first of all, like I'm not very clear about can we question policy? And if you question policy, what is the result? Is it just a question policy? Is it a question we also need to
And I can't even pretend. This is the first time I've ever engaged with this. So I think you asking the question is much better than me trying to answer it. So I hope that this conversation continues with this group.
This is the first time that I have talked about Bhopal to any group in my 40-something years of being involved. But it's something I've followed the issue and the problem. I've worked with workers in several hundred petrochemical plants across this and other countries, Mexico, Canada, some in India, China, Russia, and many of those people have no idea what the hazards are in the facilities where they are employed. They deal with a certain unit, a certain process, and they know about that, but they don't know what's right next to them. A big storage tank that they walk by every day. They could take them out if they had a rupture. So it's really, really important for the people who work in a facility or have a job someplace, know a little bit about that facility and what the overall conditions are. Industries and government don't like to talk and train people about what hazards exist, say, at a military base or at a chemical plant, because they're dealing with what they consider top secret and how to make lots of money. And they worry about competition. And I certainly don't know everything about all of the industries that are in my neighborhood and all the groups that I've worked with. But I try to learn and I try to help people understand what these things are and where they can get additional information. But I think nobody right now that I'm aware of is going to talk to their U.S. senators about what recommendations are going to be made about how we can make communities safer. The problem in West Texas, where it killed, I think, 15 people, when they were responding to a fire was that the fire department knew nothing about what was being stored there and what the hazards were. So they were a totally vulnerable group of people. And this was the fire department of a small town of, I think, 2,600 people. They now are missing 4/5 of their fire department. That's a pretty significant thing to happen to a community, because if they have a fire the next week or the next month or the next year, they don't have enough firemen or fire trucks, because the fire trucks were destroyed in that accident also. And just because people feel that they don't want to challenge maybe a Dow Chemical or an Exxon or something, that's fine, because not everybody's up to that kind of issue. But I think it's really important for people to know who their public officials are, and when you have an issue, if I had a group with this many people from this many places, you don't have to be a resident of the United States to have an interest in what's going on in your community. Your community is where you're living right now. What do we know about this area? From here to the airport, I just rode from the airport to here. We passed a community with a whole bunch of industries. I could smell it. So what is that? It's an oil refinery. And the reason I ask what is that is because I'm legally blind. I don't have any central vision. And everybody inside of this circle, I can't see. I can see the rest of the people who see this little child doing something in the field. So when I look at an industry, if I look directly at it, I usually can't see it. And I had to quit driving 20 years ago. But for me to try and tell you or any people here how to approach a problem, I'd need a little more information. But all of you, I hope, now have my address, my email, my telephone number. You can contact me. I don't have a staff. It's just me. The computer owns in the little room, but I'll be glad to try and help you with any questions you might have.
And it goes back to the point that you made earlier, is that, we can walk into a community and to know what someone else's community is dealing with.
And I can't pretend to tell this group what I think you ought to do. You have to sort of decide that. But if you're not interested in any of those sorts of things, doing that, maybe only 2 of you are interested, and that's fine. If 2 or 3 people out of this meeting are interested in doing more on this, that would be fabulous. I'd love to work with you. But I'm not looking for more work.
So we are kind of out of time, but I was thinking, I see more hands up. We can, I can put this up on the call session. Maybe we can do a small breakout session with those of you who are interested in asking Willie and Maya more questions and in getting involved with the campaign. That's a better option. And, I see hands. I don't want to.
You should take
My name is James, and I'm with Amnesty International, and I do Wikimedia history. And both Falls initiative, Amnesty worked on for years and years, and this year it's also a priority because of the anniversary. And I also know that the ICCB, the international campaign, this fall is also a priority. I guess for them it's always a priority, but I guess one thing I was thinking about in terms of what AID, like to go back to what AID can actually do, I wonder if AID might be an organization that would be somewhat uniquely placed to, and follow up on what you were talking about, William, influencing government officials in the media. And with the election coming up and with kind of development full speed ahead going on, in a lot of respects, there are good regulations that do exist. So I wonder if part of what AID can do would be to press, I mean, this certainly, I'm sure, would be an uphill battle, but to press government officials to make sure those sorts of laws and regulations are actually agreed to and are actually followed. I don't know, there's just an idea to throw out there that it seems like Amnesty, a group like Amnesty, isn't necessarily in a great position to do that, but AID might be better able to have that.
Well, I appreciate that. I know almost as much about what AID could do as you do. They've only been here a few hours or a couple of days. And I hope to learn a lot more.
And also personally, I think if all of us as aiders can also think about the chemicals we use in our daily lives that are being produced in those plants in communities, and you know, try to eliminate or at least reduce them. Because there are these everyday chemicals that people use here every day, and you know, try to look at ingredients and where they come from. I think that's important.
That's a really important approach. Dow is the company that brought us things like napalm, which is an extremely effective use in war that basically cooks the enemy. Agent Orange, with Agent Orange was two pesticides, 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D, which were used in forests and croplands all across this country before they were used to make Agent Orange. It was just a very effective defoliant, which is something that makes all the leaves fall out of the trees. And Agent Orange, once the Vietnam War was over, the U.S. government gave Agent Orange as a surplus material to agricultural people and people who were dealing with water hyacinths and stuff growing in waterways. It was distributed all across the United States. So it was good enough to help destroy North Vietnam, and it was then used and sprayed all across the United States. And 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T are now banned today, but they were still in use in rice and sugarcane years after they were banned, and they were used in Louisiana as an agricultural stuff, and this stuff drifted all over the place and contaminated all sorts of waterways. And Dow was a major producer of those too. Other people produced them, but you know, it's not an easy story to figure out who does what where and everything, so that's a lot of research. But if you can focus on something and say, I'd like to see if I can try and do something about this, and talk to people, find somebody you can talk with, read more than one book or one article about it, and get organized a little bit if you want to do something with more than just one person as a rule, where you can be more effective. I think you can have a change. You may feel like things haven't changed in India, but there have been dramatic changes. I mean, it certainly has changed from the time when the British controlled India. And there's a lot of things that have happened since then. And there's a lot of resistance in this country to whatever President Obama is going to do with his federal agencies about responding to the disaster in West Texas and several other industrial accidents in the United States since the West Texas disaster. But that doesn't mean that people shouldn't work to try and help make their communities safer and better place to live.
So I just want to add, we are thinking of solutions of what needs to be done, but how many of us here feel that it's important to continue for justice over? Okay, so that is a good enough reason for us to actually continue fighting and working on solutions that we need. So, thank you.
I'm happy to answer any more. In the past is done, and it can continue doing this. That whenever there has been an anniversary, there have been small vigils, and there have been, as part of the ICJB, lots of small events. And aid, because it's present in lots of places, can do these events. And the other thing is, even if we don't want to go out ourselves and be there, but if individuals who are aid volunteers want to go out and be at a board member's house or their vicinity, that was a good idea, because sort of puts a lot of pressure. And There have been very successful implements that traders have done in the past. These can be done.
I mean, one of the outcomes of the Bhopal accident was that Union Carbide doesn't exist today. Dow took it over, but they were a very powerful chemical industry, very strong. And Bhopal really did them in. And it was not Bhopal, it was their failure to adequately respond to the disaster that did them in. Well,
So I think that
but I'm just trying to make a point that one of the largest chemical corporations in the world failed because they were not doing the job they should have done to respond to the disaster in Bhopal.
So until that starts happening, and until you start thinking about different, newer, better ways of doing things and transitioning the form of economy that was currently the way that we are subsistent now, things, incremental changes can happen. So,
and this nice lady and I did not meet until yesterday. And I'm just assuming she's a nice lady.
Again, just like tiny things that sometimes like maybe personal being done in chapter is also so. The thing is that not just to go back to the fact that conversations of sustainable development, especially because now development, again, what kinds of development are models that India as a country is looking at, is to really engage public at large. Like really, people don't even understand. I mean, partly because we have such a terrible media, they don't really cover issues of environmental pollution or contamination or communities facing environmental problems. So really when you do see something like this in alternate forms of media, articles about how communities are being affected, sharing on Facebook, have events where you are bringing people and informing them about these sort of things happening, and to kind of create that or throw light on the fact that people unfortunately they focus on development, especially the economic model, maybe because they don't understand these hidden costs. So trying to make them understand that the cost might also be one of the ways that people will start to develop this.
In every country in the world, only a tiny percentage of the people are going to get involved in dealing with how corporations or governments deal with things, because they don't have the time or the interest. They're dealing with a job, family, friends that may need some help with something. They're just busy with life. And are they busy going to a garden club show or something? So it's only usually it's a handful of people that work on something that connecting with other people that are able to make very significant changes. And it may take, how long did it take women in this country to get the right to vote? Before they had that, they were not real people. They were not full participants in the democracy, what's called a democracy in the United States of America. How long was it before African Americans had full citizenship in the United States of America? Well, they got some laws changed in the 1950s, but there was really no black elected officials in the state of Louisiana until the 1970s. That's a big gap there, and there are not that many today. How long was it before Native Americans were recognized as having full citizenship in this country? Only happened very recently. In most of the history of this country, Native Americans were not considered as people. Now they have a museum in the National Mall in Washington, D.C. and there's something dealing with Dr. Martin Luther King on the mall. That's very dramatic, unthinkable things back in 1900. That would not have been possible. So if you only think in a short term, it's hard to see things very often. I can't see very many things because I to go driving 20 years. But it can happen. And there's a whole bunch of other things. But we're dealing with a system where you have the government is very involved. I mean, the biggest buyer of Agent Orange and napalm, two things that I mentioned earlier, was the U.S. government. That's not a minor connection between Dow Chemical and the U.S. government. They're not going to. The government is not going to go beat up on Dow because they have napalm and Agent Orange, because they've got other parts of the government that are having secret agreements with them to do whatever. So it's not some simple process. It's not a short-term process. It's a Miles Parton book, The Long Haul. If you have not read The Long Haul, I would highly encourage you to do that. It's a really good book.
I just want to answer your question to the best of my knowledge, and sort of take up what James was saying. As far as I know, there are certain laws regarding chemical safety in India. There just isn't really a regulatory body that enforces them and sees to it that it's followed. The other major problem is that there's no collation of data on existing chemical disasters. Like Shrika Narayan visited us a while ago, sometime this year, last year. And she talked about the issue in Kodaikanal. So it's the same problem everywhere. And that, I feel, is something we can ask of the government. I agree, Nepal is a thorny issue. It's difficult to, question policy. But then asking the government, okay, so what are you going to do in the event of a disaster is a perfectly reasonable question as a citizen of the country. I think that's something we can enforce. Yes. Do a little bit of research on that, and that's something we can definitely ask of the government. I think that's a fair thing we can do. So I think with that, I'm going to conclude. Thank you so much, Uri and Maya.
And again, if you don't want the handout, I'll be glad to take it back. Don't be shy. Or if you need another one, don't be shy either.
So, I think we need a minute of your time. We have this announcement for all our women sathis. We want to take 5-10 minutes together, maybe around dinner time, and a little bit of sharing on menstruation around it. So we are suggesting that if we break at 8:40 for dinner, we just take 10 minutes and we meet at the kids section. Is that all right with all women sathis? We excluding all men sathis. And we in the kids section in that gallery. When we break for dinner, we can meet there first and then go to dinner.
So after the 5 minutes break, there is going to be the evening session. Please come back. Please come back in this, and then we start the and actors for performance, please come. And people who are busy, come please visit our table. We have lots of nice funny books, adventure stories set in wild places in India. I mean, books are really nice. And yeah, funny books on there.
I asked him
I don't you spend 15 minutes gathering everyone to sacrifice and then
So I don't. Oh yeah, that's easy. This Imam. Jason. Not audible. Please. That's good. This looks like no, it's okay. Here is one just for a yang.
I'll pass on now. Where is it? Oh.
I won't eat your book.
Whoa. There's a tornado. Yeah. Yeah, no, my friend just messaged me.
Yeah, exactly. The biggest session ever. Yeah, it'll be difficult. For the workplace, feedback. But you can but he wasn't there for the. My name is Meenakshi. I'm just happy to be okay, Meenakshi. Okay. I think that.
That is a fear. That is a fear.
Archana, Neni.